student and staff voice need to be central to this public mission. And because they're central to this public mission, they need to be at the heart or at the center of university decision making.
From a professor of labor law's perspective, why unionizing matters?
It boils down to a mantra we have within NTEU is that staff working conditions are student learning conditions. Yeah. So you need to actually have decent working conditions to have effective learning conditions.
Hello, my name is Rafiqa A'yun, and I am your host for the SPKTalks, a YouTube podcast presented by Serikat Pekerja Kampus, the largest union for university workers in Indonesia. This podcast features unionists, experts, observers, and those with concerns about the union movements from around the globe. Here we will discuss insights and experiences from other countries, exploring historical context, union struggles in the past, their victories and losses, to understand the best strategies for navigating contemporary challenges in union organizing. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome Professor Joo-Cheong Tham as our guest. He is a professor at Melbourne Law School, the University of Melbourne, with expertise in labor law and public law. His research focuses on the regulation of precarious work, and his doctoral thesis examined the legal precariousness of casual employment, and he has a significant body of work on migrant labor. He has also researched labor protection under trade agreements. Professor Joo-Cheong Tham is the National Tertiary Education Union's Victorian Assistant Secretary, an academic staff, and an inaugural director of the Center for Public Integrity. He has also been the deputy chair of the Migrant Worker Centers. Hello, Professor Tham. Thank you so much for joining us.
More than welcome, ya. Saya senang hati sekali lagi anda jemput saya buat ni temu bual, ya. So saya harap saya boleh membantu semua ahli-ahli Serikat Pekerja Kampus dengan temu bual ini.
Yeah, we are excited to hear your thoughts as a professor of labor law and your experiences with organizing at the National Tertiary Education Union, especially at the University of Melbourne branch. So I will start my first question about the history. When did university workers start to unionize in Australia? And what is the story behind the birth of the union movement in the higher education sector?
So in fact, the history is relatively recent. So the union presently it's called the National Tertiary Education Union. So it's an industry-wide union that operates on a national basis, and it covers virtually all staff at Australian universities. And then the main groups being the academic staff and the professional staff. But I say it's relatively recent because the NTEU, that's the acronym, was only formed in 1993. So just a bit over 30 years ago. And it was really an amalgamation of a number of organizations and with quite messy origins, really. There were organizations were basically staff associations at various institutions. There were some function not so much as industrial organizations, but really as staff clubs. And then you had state-based organizations, some of which covered what was called the colleges of advanced education, so not universities. And even after the establishment in 1993, the amalgamation of these various organizations, there was quite a sort of a messy, complicated process where the union actually extended coverage. Initially, its coverage was mainly restricted to academic staff. And it's really over a space of probably about half a dozen years that basically through organizing efforts that it basically gained the legitimacy and the right to basically cover not just academic staff, but also professional staff.
Interesting. So how challenging is back then unionizing in Australian university? If you can summarize.
I think it's challenging, but perhaps not more challenging than the general challenge of unionizing in Australia. And I think in some ways, because the employers in this sector are very large employers, and they're place-based organizations with big buildings. As in Indonesia, it can be you can have easier access to workers. But nevertheless, I think the general challenge that we face as a union and other unions face in Australia are formidable. I think at the heart of it is about persuading workers there's value in joining the union. And here, I think there are certain distinctive challenges in the higher education sector. I think there's a culture of individualism that can be quite pronounced. I think especially amongst academics. And I think there's also the notion, not just with academics, but also from professional staff, that because people have higher education qualifications or professionals, they have sufficient power individually, and therefore do not have to actually organize collectively. And I think on top of that, I think, again, the two general structural problems affecting all unions in Australia, including the NTEU, and which are worth highlighting. One is the free rider problem. So unions across Australia would bargain for collective agreements, and those collective agreements, in fact, will cover all workers in that workplace. Yeah. So even when you're not a union member, you could still benefit from union organizing. So that's a free rider problem. I think the second problem, and I'm happy to go into a bit more detail if it's helpful, is that there's a restrictive bargaining regime. Right. So there's a restrictive bargaining regime, both in terms of the level of bargaining. So the Fair Work Act, which is the main Australian industrial statute, essentially has a structural bias towards enterprise level bargaining. Yeah, bargaining at enterprise level. So in fact, it severely impedes industry-wide bargaining or even bargaining at the regional level. And that flows on through, right? Some of the restrictions flow on through to the subject matter bargaining, what you can bargain for, and also your ability to take what's called protected industrial action.
Interesting about the free ride. If I can explore more, how many NTEU members for now, and how many full-time staff does NTEU have to run the organization?
I think in terms of the nation, in terms of Australia-wide, NTEU has got about probably 100 or so staff, and I think in terms of headcount. And so it's a, how would I say this? It's probably a medium-sized union, I would say, I think, in terms of Australia. But of course, the payment of the staff are dependent on union dues, right? And the issue has been, I think partly the free rider problem is, also a function of the legal regime, in the sense that what the regime precludes union from bargaining for and taking industrial action for are what's called bargaining services fee. So one way to deal with the free rider problem is that, you don't necessarily require people to be union members, but if they're benefiting from the collective agreement, they should pay a certain fee to the union in terms of the benefits they enjoy. But that is actually something that cannot be bargained for in Australia legally.
Okay. And how important is the existence of a strong legal framework in supporting the right to unionize, and also this kind of the free ride problem, as you mentioned? And what are the most crucial ones in guaranteeing unionizing in the higher education sector?
Yeah. I think a strong legal framework, I think, firstly, is absolutely critical. I think the ability for unions to organize, in my mind, depends on certain negative rights, freedom from, and certain positive rights, freedom to. I think the important negative right is that there needs to be effective protection against victimization, for engaging in union activities. So being a member of the union, being an official of the union, or engaging in the collective activities of the union. But also, importantly, there need to be positive rights. I think unions and their representatives need to have the ability to access workplaces, access workers, and also communicate with workers. And I think in Australia, including the higher education sector, I think it's fair to say the laws are generally strong in these respects. Enforcement is a different issue, but the laws are generally strong. But what is far less robust are the laws regarding the ability to collectively bargain and to take industrial action. And it is quite well known. I mean, the International Labour Organization supervisory committees have repeatedly found that Australian industrial laws breach the ILO conventions on freedom of association. And they do so for three reasons. One of which I mentioned is those of which I mentioned. that the fact they restrict the level of bargaining mainly to the enterprise level. They restrict the subject matter of bargaining. So, for example, bargaining services fees cannot be bargained for. And they also restrict the ability to take industrial action.
And speaking of industrial action, so what tactics are used when advocating for members involved in this industrial disputes? Mostly litigation or strikes, or does NTEU have also its own in-house legal team?
So I think the way the NTEU sees itself is both as how do I say this? It engages in both industrial unionism and political unionism. Industrial unionism, I think we're familiar in the sense that it's about industrial disputes and bargaining. But the NTEU has also been active since its formation in terms of the broader political campaigns regarding the higher education sector. So once you put that in place, really, in my mind, there are three types of tactics. So there's an industrial tactics, organizing and taking collective action, such as industrial action. Then there are the legal tactics, including litigation. Then there are the political tactics, which involve campaigning, the use of media, and lobbying. I think in my mind, and what I've tried to push within the union, is that the importance of integrating all three: industrial, legal, and political. So a good example is the campaign to deal with the industry-wide wage theft in Australia. Clearly, for us to actually mobilize in this issue, we needed to organize workers, including those who are underpaid and those on casual contracts, to basically be able to speak out. We've taken court actions to enforce the laws, but also we ensured that this dirty secret of the higher education sector, which is basically affected a whole range of universities, was highly publicized in the media, and that publicity that was then leveraged to basically lobby for reforms to laws to ensure that this kind of non-compliance with laws, this underpayment, is much less likely to occur.
And speaking of the industrial, can you also elaborate on how does NTEU typically organize them, like including developing mitigation plans to address the risk of members being laid off if they participate?
Yeah. So I think industrial action in Australia occurs in a very highly legalized context. Yeah. So there's actually a whole series of rules that need to be met for that to be what's called protected industrial action. And what I mean by protected industrial action is that when industrial action that's protected from actions of the employers, such as dismissal, demotions, and so on and so forth. So usually what happens, and it really depends on the cycle, the stage of the negotiation, and really at a point where basically I think where the discussions between management have reached a certain roadblock, and then we feel that we need to have industrial action to apply pressure. Before we can take protected industrial action, we need to actually ballot our members. Yeah. So the members have to actually say yes to taking protected industrial action. And then usually there'll be a series of actions. And all of them, because of the highly legalized context, the industrial tactics have to be combined with the legal tactics.
And what is the legal tactics in this case?
I think the legal tactics are a lot of it is, well, firstly making sure that the rules are met in terms of being able to engage in protected industrial action. Yep. And then the ballot that goes to the members too have to basically stipulate what industrial action the members be taking. So there are actually also legal tactics in terms of thinking, how do we engage in industrial action is effective, but also within the envelope of the law. And then at times too, of course, there can be managers that basically seek to take adverse action against our members. And then I think is ensuring that there's the protection against victimization is not just de jure or as a matter of black letter, but also de facto.
And there is also perception that industrial action by university workers will infringe students' rights to education. How does NTEU address this kind of concern?
I think clearly we've any university unions or any education union, even primary schools and secondary school, this is a key tension to navigate, right? Because industrial action often disrupts classroom teaching and therefore affects the learning of students. I think for me, it's the need to go beyond the perception of an inherent contradiction, between the rights of the university workers and the rights of the students. How do we go beyond that? I think it's firstly by emphasizing that freedom of association and ability to take strike action are also human rights. And this is clearly and expressly recognized in the International Covenant of Economic and Social Rights. I think the other important level to sort of deal with this possible contradiction, and it really boils down to a mantra we have within NTEU, is that staff working conditions are student learning conditions. So you need to actually have decent working conditions to have effective learning conditions. Now, a good example is job security. So we've emphasized as a union that job security for university workers is essential. It's essential for academic freedom. Tenure is essential for academic freedom. And it's also essential in terms of the stewardship of courses that's required for academic quality. So I think that's another level. I think you can deal with this contingent tension. I think the other way to deal with it, and we've done it in many cases, is to ensure that I think in that bargaining campaign there are also strong alliances with student organizations. So that when a strike is called as a rally in a bargaining campaign, you'll find in most NTEU rallies that it's not just staff to speak, but there's students who speak and saying that, look, we can't have, for example, our academics suffering from excessive working hours because they can't provide us with an effective learning experience if they don't have enough time, for example, to provide feedback or mark assignments and so on.
Yeah, and being an institution with a public purpose like education, what do you think is an ideal form of a university that allows workers to have decent welfare and improved working condition without ignoring its public goals to provide affordable education?
Yeah, I think this is a really important question. I think we should always have in mind, about what it is that should be the desirable form of university to advance that public purpose, as you said. And it's, of course, a complex question. So in my mind, just to be brief, I think three elements are vital. One is that I think in a discussion, there needs to be foregrounding the public mission of universities. And their public mission is to provide higher education and research. And I think the second point I'll make is that it's undeniable that sufficient public funding is necessary for this public mission to be discharged. It is hard to imagine a system, of universities that achieves its public mission, that's completely based on private funding. I think you need sufficient public funding, both in terms of equitable access to higher education for the students, but also in terms of quality of teaching and research. And I think thirdly, and I'll say this, I think, and this is a critical principle of university governance that I would argue, is that student and staff voice need to be are central to this public mission. And because they're central to this public mission, they need to be at the heart or at the center of university decision-making. So there needs to be actually a democratizing dynamics within university decision-making that integrates staff, students, and their representatives.
It's sufficient public funding is the key in this question. Correct. Right? Yes. And with a crisis in higher education that affects the financial burden on education and research funding, how do you think the union movements can be involved to put pressure on the state to allocate more funding to university and the workers?
Yeah. This is also a very important and great question, and I think there's no easy answer to this because, of course, the funding that the government can provide, every dollar it gives to the university is $1 it doesn't give to some other activity, whether it be hospitals or to the building of roads and so on. I think the answer to me is that I think it needs to be this continuous civil society campaign that's both broad and deep, that emphasizes the public importance of higher education and research. Yeah. So I think for us in the NTU is again seeing the fact that we want strong working conditions, not simply because for the workers themselves, even though that's a really compelling justification, but that these decent working conditions are crucial for in terms of the public interest as advanced by universities. And what are the public interest benefits of universities? I think in my mind they fall into two categories. Those are the intrinsic and those are instrumental. So intrinsic in the sense of saying that education is key to human development and that knowledge should be valued in itself. But also instrumental in the sense that I think educational institutions ought to play a role in promoting social justice, so the social benefits there. They should drive innovation, so there's an economic aspect there, and they should strengthen democracy, so there's also political benefit there. And I think it's really drawing together these multiple benefits, intrinsic, instrumental, social, political, and economic, and really building an alliance that is strong and cohesive, that goes beyond the union movement, right? To include other important institutions, okay? For people to understand, look, yes, of course, we should fund universities. In the same way that perhaps people should think like, well, of course we should fund primary schools and secondary schools. Yes, okay. So I think the battle in some ways has been won at the earlier levels of education, and I think it can be advanced to the tertiary level of education.
And about the alliance, if we talk about the political alliance, did the University Workers Union in Australia have any political channels or organization that link their struggles at the workplace with those at the state level?
I think we don't have any we don't do it through an organization. So I think both the NTU, I mean, and for example, I'm leading the Victorian Division's campaign for better university governance, and I think key to that, well, the objective of that campaign is really to reform the state laws. So it's also then requires the building of relationships with the members of parliament, of the Victorian Parliament, and so on. And we have a similar sort of mode or campaign at the national level. We're dealing with university governance too, by basically building relationships, advocating to across the political spectrum as to the importance of university governance.
Interesting. And among the many advocacies undertaken by NTEU at the University of Melbourne, is there a certain percentage of victories achieved? And what are the main factors that you think contributed more to these victories?
So by way of context, I led the union's bargaining team at the last completed bargaining round. And I think we ran a strong campaign. I think there was many achievements to this campaign, two of which I feel particularly important. One is that I think we took strong industrial action for our sector. So we took 2 rounds of 1 week long strikes. Yeah. And that really, in my mind, really shifts the paradigm of thinking about how we can take effective industrial action. So previously, the norm had been to take industrial action that's but 1 or 2 days, okay? And in my mind, they can be of limited effectiveness, whereas I think we're thinking of the kind of, on the spectrum of a 1 week long strike. I think that sort of shifts how we think about these. I think the other, in terms of the substantive claim, there was a strong win for job security. And I think by actually, and we face here in the sector an insecure workforce model where universities and sometimes nearly half of their workforce are on casual or fixed term contracts. So one of the wins I feel particularly important was that in the collective agreement, continuing employment was enshrined as the preferred mode of employment. Yeah. Now, why I think there are many reasons for why I think these things succeeded. One is that, firstly, I should emphasize none of this was easy. So none of this was easy. So it's probably, as I say, in hindsight and after the campaign, it can sound much simpler than what it was, right? Things are often in the beginning of campaign very messy, very complex. But looking back, it seemed me, I think, firstly, there needs to be a compelling vision for the university. And you have basically your bargaining claims need to basically make concrete this vision. Then you need to have effective organizing industrial tactics combined with legal tactics. And underlying those two elements is really concerted member participation. Yeah. So there needs to be leadership, but leadership that's basically supported strongly from the ground, from the bottom up.
Yeah, so among those challenges, it's like what is the most difficult to tackle? Like there are welfare issues like casualization, wage theft, and increasing workloads. So how do you approach this?
In my mind, I think the most difficult one and one that hasn't been effectively addressed is the problem of excessive working hours and workload. And I think arguably it is because at its root is a culture of excessive working hours that many staff at the universities participate in. So what you have is a culture of excessive working hours that resulting from a complex mix of social norms, some internalized by many workers, as well as weak regulation. And I think it's fair to say we have not effectively addressed this problem as a union, even though we constantly bargain on the question of workload. So it's often one of the top three topics you find that unions bargain for, the NTEU branches bargain for when it comes to a bargaining round. But I think it's fair to say whatever clauses have been won in those process have not effectively dealt with the problem. So in my mind, I think what is imperative here is to recognize, firstly, that we've had limited success with past efforts. And I think what is then crucial is that we explore fresh approaches in terms of going forward.
And after industrial and legal tactics, we talk about the participation as well and how important the leadership in the union can bring success in this matter.
Yes, that's right. I think sometimes leadership can seem like a dirty word to some rank and file members, but I think, of course, unions, as any organizations, require leadership. The question is what kind of leadership is both effective and legitimate. Yeah, and in the case of a union, of course, it needs to be leadership that is democratically accountable. So that's what I meant by you still need to have leadership in terms of the people representatives that actually will decide, okay, all right, this is the broad strategy, but that broad strategy needs to have needs to command the support of the members that are affected.
Very important. So my final question, could you please explain from a professor of labor laws perspective why unionizing matters?
I think for me, it matters in two broad ways, right? Democracy and social justice. So democracy in a sense that I think unions are a vehicle, in some ways, the indispensable vehicle for workers' voice at their workplaces. And the workplaces, of course, for adults are places where they spend most of their working hours. So I think the union movement stands for this important proposition that democracy, does not end at the door of the office or at the factory gates. Yeah, democracy is not just for election time and casting votes, even though, of course, those institutions are absolutely important. Yeah, so democracy. Social justice. I think unions, by providing that countervailing power to management, can facilitate workers having a fair share of the fruits of industry and the fruits of progress. Yeah. So, and I think trading through both of them is, I think, the theme of human rights that you've highlighted. And what is clear is that labor rights, such as an entitlement to fair wages, reasonable working hours, freedom of association, and right to strike, are fundamental human rights. Yeah, and again, well expressly recognized by the International Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So I think we need to be thinking about human rights lens, not just in terms of what are traditionally seen as civil political rights, but also capturing these key labor rights, which are well recognized by the International Human Rights Covenants.
Thank you so much, Joo-Cheong, for your insightful discussion. Professor Joo-Cheong Tham, labor law expert at Melbourne Law School and the National Tertiary Education Union's Victorian Assistant Secretary. As we wrap this episode, let's leave one thing clear. Learning from union movements elsewhere is not just about comparison. It's a source of strategy and strength. So let's take this conversation with you into your workplace, your union, and your organizing space. Thank you for watching and listening to SPK Talks. Stay organized and stay in solidarity. We'll see you again in the next episode with another guest.